Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. And let's stand together as we read the first 10 verses of this chapter. Exodus chapter 2. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not hide him longer, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what should be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent to her maid to fetch it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, Because I drew him out of the water. Thank you. You may be seated. The title of my message today is Jochebed, the Story of a Great Mother. Jochebed, the Story of a Great Mother. She is not named in the passage that we just read in Exodus chapter 2, but she is identified by name elsewhere in Scripture. She is identified by name in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 20, and she's identified by name in Numbers chapter 26 and verse 59. And her name is Jochebed. Jochebed in the English spelling. Her name means Jehovah glorified. And she certainly lived up to her name. By the time the events took place that we read in Exodus chapter 2, Jochebed had already given birth to 2 previous children, Aaron and Miriam. Miriam was far and away the oldest of the 3. In fact, she was probably in her mid to late teens by the time that Aaron was born, who was some, if I remember right, 3 years older than Moses. And then, of course, Moses was the youngest of the 3. Aaron and Miriam were obviously born before the Pharaoh's edict to kill all the male Hebrew babies. Somewhere after the birth of Aaron and before the birth of Moses, Pharaoh had issued the order that his soldiers were to kill all Hebrew male babies that were born. So Moses was born after that edict had been issued by Pharaoh. As we see in our text, she was from the tribe of Levi, as was her husband Amram. By the way, Amram lived to be 137 years old. He had a long, full life. They were both from the priestly tribe, which was very significant. This was the tribe, of course, that belonged to God. This was the tribe that were the priests of Israel came out of. They were the very special priestly tribe of Israel. Both Jochebed and Amram were from the tribe of Levi. I included Jochebed in the message that I brought several months ago that many of you heard, and that's on the table if you'd like to hear it. I entitled that message, Iron Women of the Bible. I did that after Lady Margaret Thatcher passed away. A movie was made in her honor Meryl Streep was the actress that played her character, and the title of it was The Iron Lady. And when I saw that and I thought about the great women of the Bible, I titled the message after that, The Iron Women of the Bible. Jochebed was one of the women, if you recall, that I included in that list, and I would do so again. I want to give you a couple of things about her, and I hope I can fill in some of the things that I left out when I talked about her before. First of all, the first thing we notice about her is in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, where she dared to defy Pharaoh's commandment. You know, these people that preach that Romans 13 teaches that Christians are supposed to obey the government no matter what, if they really are honest with themselves, in order to believe that doctrine, they're going to have to rip out a whole lot of the Bible. Because the Bible is replete with examples of God's people who refused to submit to unjust, evil, wicked laws. Filled with Scripture. In fact, most of the great characters of the Bible, I would challenge you to go through the characters of the Old and New Testament and try to find one that didn't break man's law, that didn't defy unrighteous, unjust civil authority. The vast majority of the characters of the Bible did so and were commended by God for what they did, and they were justified by God in what they did, not the least of which was Jochebed, the mother of Moses. She dared to defy Pharaoh's commandment. Hebrews 11:23 says this in commentary on what we just read. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Meaning they were not intimidated or afraid to disobey this unjust law of the king. Now, by the baby Moses being described, and in the Old Testament description, it identifies him as a goodly child. The New Testament refers to him as a proper child. What these words mean is that Moses was, as a baby, extremely beautiful. He was truly a beautiful baby in not only the human sense of the word, but apparently God had given Moses a supernatural beauty that most, if not all, babies would not have. There was something about his face that was extraordinarily beautiful. God gave him a special anointing on his appearance, and that was going to be very important as this story develops. Jochebed understood from the time that Moses was born that God was going to do something special with this child. Therefore, her decision to hide the baby in the bulrushes along the Nile River was as much an act of faith as it was an act of self-defense. She was acting at a principle of self-defense, for sure, to save the life of the little baby. But she was also acting with the spirit of faith. She knew instinctively that God was going to do something with Moses. Did she know exactly what he was going to do? Probably not. But she had to have known that God had something special in mind for Moses because of the appearance that he had as a child. Remember, this is her third child, not her first. So she understood the difference in the look and the appearance of Moses from the other two. By hiding the baby in the bulrushes of the Nile River. Now follow me because I'm going to take you through this in a way with detail that maybe you've never heard before. She knew that Pharaoh's daughter, Josephus names her Thermothis, would come to the river to bathe and would be accompanied by 4 Egyptian maidens. This was Thermothis' routine. Anyone who lived in that area would have known that she would have come to the river's edge at about that same location and that she would bathe in the river. Now, this is consistent with Egyptian history. In later Egyptian history, royalty, the women of royalty, would never go to the river to bathe. Only the commoners would do that. But in early Egyptian history, the feeling among the Egyptian people, including royalty, was that the Nile River had godlike qualities. They worshipped the Nile River. They believed that by bathing in the Nile, it would give health and it would give long life. Thermothis was childless. She would come to the river to bathe. She obviously, in her thinking, according to the religious upbringing that she had, she believed that by bathing in the Nile, it would increase her fertility. It would perhaps give her more of an opportunity to bear a child. It would give her health and power and long life, etc., etc. So, according to early Egyptian history, this was very consistent. Jochebed knew this was not an act of happenstance. This was not just her putting Moses in the river somewhere in the hopes that she might protect him from discovery. Not at all. She put him at the river's edge where she knew that Thermothis would come to bathe. She knew that she would be accompanied by 4 women servants. She knew that she would be there at about the same time of day. She put him in the river at the right moment, at the right place, fully intending for Thermothis to find the baby. This was a well thought out, strategic action on the part of Jochebed. Miriam, the older sister, again probably in her mid to late teens, is considerably older than Aaron and now Moses, was instructed to hide nearby to watch and see if Thermothis would take the child, would discover the child, take the child, and protect the baby Moses as Jochebed believed and hoped. She was hoping and praying that Thermothis would see the baby, would be struck with compassion for this beautiful baby that she would see. She knew that she was childless. She was hoping and praying that she would discover this child and would save this little baby. In reality, this was the only person in the entire nation of Egypt that had the power to save this little baby boy. This baby was under a death sentence. The Pharaoh himself had ordered that all male babies be killed. There was not another person in the entire kingdom that could have protected and saved Moses. Only his daughter, Pharaoh's daughter, Thermothis, the only woman in the entire country that could have protected and saved Jochebed. Jochebed understood this. Jochebed planned this. Thermothis found the baby, as Jochebed hoped that she would. When she saw the baby and removed the top of the little ark, the baby immediately cried. I don't know if whenever your baby cries, you think that God inspired your baby to cry. But when Moses cried that cry, It was a God-inspired cry. Thermothis found the baby. She fell in love with the baby. She immediately recognized two things about him. She recognized, number one, how absolutely, stunningly beautiful he was. Number two, she recognized that he was the son of a Hebrew. She took the baby. Miriam immediately appeared as if there by coincidence. Would you like me to find a Hebrew woman that could nurse this baby? Jochebed said, Thermothis says, yes, please do. Of course, Miriam went and found her mother, Jochebed, who kept and cared for Moses until he was weaned. At which time she took him to Thermothis, but in all likelihood continued to serve as a nursemaid to Moses in the palace of Pharaoh. While she did this, she taught Moses about Jehovah God. She taught Moses about the story of God's people. She taught Moses about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. She taught Moses about creation. She taught Moses about the deliverance of Joseph. She taught him about the trials and afflictions of God's people, the deliverance of God's people under Joseph. She taught him the entire history of her people. And she became not only his nurse and his nursemaid, but also his teacher and, of course, his loving mother. Thermothis named Moses. It's interesting. Moses, the deliverer and the judge of Israel, was named by an Egyptian with an Egyptian name. Moses' name means rescued from the water. Rescued from the water. How fitting a name that is, because this same one who was rescued from the water is going to rescue God's people from bondage 40 years later. Thermothis later became Queen Hatshepsut. Now, for those of you that know anything about this history, you want to pay attention to this, because I'm going to share some things with you today that I think are going to help clear up some of the discrepancies in the story of who was the Pharaoh. And that's been a question that historians and Bible students have battered back and forth for centuries. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? If you remember Charlton Heston's story in the Ten Commandments, they picture the Pharaoh as being Ramses. I think we can say almost without hesitation or reservation that Ramses II was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But anyway, Thermothis, the daughter of Pharaoh, became Queen Hatshepsut, who was probably, again, the only person in Egypt that could have had the power and authority to save this little Hebrew's life. The daughter of Pharaoh, and then later the queen of Egypt. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. Moses is now raised in the home of the Pharaoh. So from the time of his birth and the time that he is discovered by Thermothis, the daughter of Pharaoh, on the bank of the Nile River, and for the next 40 years, there's only one verse of Scripture about Moses. Only one verse of Scripture. And it's not even in the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament. Acts chapter 7 and verse 22. And Moses was learned or schooled in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. Let's read that again. Moses was schooled, educated, learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. That is the only thing we are told about Moses from the events of his birth to the time that he was 40 years of age in the burning fiery bush, and his going back to Egypt to bring the people of Israel out of bondage. So what do we know about him? He was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in the palace of Pharaoh. He was schooled in the wisdom and the sciences of the Egyptians. He had obtained as high of an education as the Egyptians could have given him. Moses would have been one of the most educated men in the entire nation of Egypt, which was going to be very important as he became the deliverer and the judge of God's people. Are you getting a little bit cool in here? Okay, maybe turn the air just a little bit. If you start falling asleep on me, though, we're going to turn it right back down. All right? He was also schooled in the military arts of war. He was a master of the skills of military and war. He was schooled in the sciences and the arts of Egypt. So this was one of the most educated, intelligent, influential, not to mention military adept men in the entire nation of Israel. Couple that with the obvious beautiful countenance and appearance that God had given to him at birth. Moses was the most exceptional man in the entire nation of Egypt, bar none. It is no hyperbole to say that. So from the time he is born until the time of his re-entrance into the pages of history at the age of 40, all we're told is that he was learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. And the first thing that we are told about his life, the first thing that we are told about his life after the events surrounding his birth is his killing the Egyptian taskmaster in the defense of the Hebrew slave. Think about it. That's the first thing the Bible tells us about the man Moses. He killed an Egyptian taskmaster in the defense of a Hebrew slave. Now, I said this once before, not too many months ago, but for the sake of those of you that have forgotten it since I said it, I want to say it again. I don't care what you've heard. I don't care how many preachers you've heard say that what Moses did when he killed the Egyptian was murder. I'm here to tell you what Moses did was not murder. It was not murder. The defense of human life is a God-ordained natural law which God has created in all men. The right and the duty to defend life rests upon all humanity. I am so sick and tired of these ill-informed preachers besmirching the character of one of the three greatest men of the Old Testament, Moses, by insinuating or actually deliberately saying that Moses committed murder. And here's what they say. They say, well, Moses committed murder, and that was bad. That's wrong. It's wrong to murder. We all know that. And Moses shouldn't have done that. But then whenever he met God at the burning bush, that's when he found redemption. ladies and gentlemen, I'm not trying to be crude or mean, but that's a bunch of hogwash. In the New Testament, when the Bible says that Moses chose to suffer affliction with the people of God, rather to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, choosing not to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. When did he do that? He didn't do that at the burning bush. He did that when he defended the life of the Hebrew slave and killed the man who was murdering the Hebrew slave. That's not murder. Self-defense is not murder. Think about it. The first thing the Bible tells us about the man Moses was his defense of the Hebrew and his killing of the Egyptian taskmaster who was murdering a man. Josephus says that Moses, by the time he was 40 years of age, was the commanding general of Pharaoh's. Josephus is the greatest Jewish historian of all. Josephus says that Moses was commanding general of Pharaoh's army, that he was a skilled warrior, which, by the way, explains his success in defending the Midianite women at the well in the wilderness. You remember that? The shepherds were all there coming to water their flocks, and they were driving away the Midianite women, and Moses stepped in and he fought off all those men and allowed the women to water their flocks. And not only that, he helped them water their flocks. Well, we can understand that a little bit better now when we realize that Moses was a warrior, skilled in the art of war, knew how to defend and knew how to engage an enemy. While Moses was under the tutelage of his mother Jochebed, she taught her son his true duty to God and to his people. There's no other explanation for why Moses would have done this. There is no other explanation as to why Moses would have been willing to forfeit his position as the commanding general of the army of the greatest nation in the face of the earth. Why he would have walked away from perhaps an opportunity to become Pharaoh himself, which he did have that opportunity. I'll explain that in a moment. Why he would have risked everything to defend the life of a slave. Why would he have turned his back on that kind of power, that kind of privilege, that kind of wealth, that kind of position? Why would he have done that in the most remarkable way possible? By taking the life of an Egyptian taskmaster who was employed by Pharaoh himself, who was abusing his authority over the slaves and murdering one in the field. Why would he have done that? There is only one answer. From the time that Moses was born and was nursed and taught by his mother Jochebed, she taught him and instructed him in his history, the history of his people, the history of his nation, the history of his lineage, who he was, who God was. She taught him the principles of natural law that God had instituted in the very beginning of creation. She taught him the principles by which he was to live. She taught him that even though he was an Egyptian prince, that it was a pagan nation, a nation that was brutalizing God's people, a nation that was enslaving God's people, a nation that was an oppressive, tyrannical state. And even though he had been raised in that, in privilege and in position and in power, this was not of God. And son, sooner or later, you're going to have to Make a choice as to whose side you are on. You are either on God's side and the side of truth, or you are on the side of Satan and his minions. You cannot be neutral. And I submit to all of you, you and I cannot be neutral. Choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, Joshua said, we shall serve the Lord. She's taught her son all of these things. He knew in his heart who he was, where he was from, what was right, what was wrong. He understood truth, and he knew that there would come a time when he would have to, by himself, on his own, make a choice. When he saw that Egyptian beating the life out of that Hebrew slave, he knew he had to make his choice then. And that's when he stepped in on behalf of the Hebrew, killed the Egyptian taskmaster. He also realized by this time, as I've talked about this a few weeks ago, that he was God's deliverer for the people of Israel. He had that calling in his heart. He knew that he was to deliver the people of God out of bondage. He believed that when he took this bold step, think about it, the commanding general of Pharaoh's army, the son of Pharaoh's daughter, the possible a man who might possibly inherit the throne of Pharaoh, and he kills an Egyptian taskmaster in defense of a Hebrew slave. He thought that the Hebrews would understand what he had done, understand the signal that he was setting to the people. They would have understood that this was the time of their deliverance. They would have rallied to him because of who he was and because of what he did. And they would have allowed themselves to shake off the shackles of tyranny and oppression and walk out of Egypt as free men. They had the power to do it then. But instead, according to Acts chapter 7, the Bible says the men of Israel understood not what Moses was doing and who Moses was. They didn't understand it. And they didn't rally around him. In fact, they were willing to accuse him before Pharaoh. How many Christians and pastors are there in America today who understand not the principles of liberty which God has created in all men? How is it that so many of them do not understand the recourses by which God has given them, the principles to which God has instructed them, and that how God expects of them to stand for the principles of truth and righteousness and liberty as created beings of God who are accountable to the laws which God himself has instilled in our hearts, in our minds? How can they sit back, as did the Hebrews so many years ago, and not only not join with those men and women who are fighting for the principles of liberty which God has created, but are actually joining with the pagan forces of Pharaoh against God's people who fight for liberty in our land? How is that possible? And yet all over America today, we have pastors and deacons and elders and church committees and boards who would sell your soul and mine to any pagan government agency, no matter what, that quick. Why? They understand not. They understand not. So Moses made his choice. The people did not rally. He left Egypt, went to the wilderness, and was not heard from again for 40 additional years. While he was there, he married a woman, had 2 children, and for another 40 years, there is really no record of his life until the incident of the burning bush. Now let me give you a little history about this Pharaoh as we lead up to the story of Moses' return to Egypt and the exodus of God's people out of Egypt. I'm going to be quoting mostly here from one historian's account. I've read so many accounts that after a while your head just starts spinning. But this one makes more sense to me than anything that I've read, and I think is going to clear up a lot of questions that you may have about the Exodus and the story of the Pharaoh and Moses and so forth. A male was required to rule Egypt. So when her father, Thutmose I, died, he was succeeded by her half-brother. This would be the queen that we referred to a moment ago, the one who found Moses by the river, who became Queen Hatshepsut. Thutmose I died. He was succeeded by her half-brother Thutmose II, whose mother was a commoner. Hatshepsut married her half-brother, but they had no male heirs. He only lived 3 or 4 years after the marriage. At his death, she, Hatshepsut, probably wanted Moses to succeed as Pharaoh. But he was likely too young at that point. In fact, there was another little problem. Her dead husband had a son called Thutmose III, but not by her, but by a secondary common wife. Since this young son was also too young to rule at his father's death, Hatshepsut ruled as Pharaoh. At the death of her stepbrother and husband, Thutmose II, without a clear heir to the throne, it could have been Thutmose III or it could have been Moses, Hatshepsut actually became the supreme ruler of Egypt. There's a lot written about her in history. Hatshepsut, she was so determined that she would become the ultimate Pharaoh, or that she would ultimately become the Pharaoh, and she would assume the throne outright. And in order to diminish the fact that she was a woman, and therefore under Egyptian law unqualified from being Pharaoh, that she even wore a fake beard to increase her image among the Egyptians as a masculine leader. She was considered one of the greatest rulers and builders of monuments in Egypt. She literally built hundreds of monuments to herself all over Egypt. Her face was everywhere, beard and all. All the while, Thutmose III grew older and older and eventually became co-regent with her, which meant that she and Thutmose III, her stepson, were equal in power. If you can say it this way, for a period of time, Hatshepsut and Thutmose III were co-pharaohs. He took care of the military affairs, and she took care of the domestic affairs. Still, he, Thutmose III, deeply resented his stepmother, but he had no power to remove her. And he must have always had Moses in the back of his mind as his possible replacement. Hatshepsut thought that her stepson should not be Pharaoh. She despised him for the fact that he was the product of her husband's relationship with this common woman who bore this son, and she despised him for that. Hatshepsut favored Moses, and in the back of her mind probably had it set that if there was only going to be one at some point, if it couldn't be her, it would probably be Moses. So there must have been bad blood between Moses and Thutmose III from the time that they were small. Thutmose III was always jealous of Moses, his abilities, his looks, his power, his popularity, his relationship with his stepmother. He always figured that Moses would be the one that could be heir to the throne instead of him. So there had to have been this ongoing jealousy and resentment from the time those little boys were small as they grew up there in Pharaoh's house. So when Moses was 40 and he killed the Egyptian, he had to run for his life, or co-Pharaoh Thutmose III would have taken opportunity to kill him certainly. This was the excuse that Thutmose III would have needed to get rid of Moses once and forever. The threat that Moses might be to his reign. And so when he did this, and Moses recognized that the people of Israel were not going to rally with him, instead they were going to accuse him to Thutmose III, he recognized that he had to leave Egypt, which is exactly what he did. He knew that there would be no mercy whatsoever from Thutmose III. Moses fled to Egypt and was gone for 40 years. It was not until he was 80 years of age that he came back and led the children of Israel out of Egypt. By then, Thutmose III was full Pharaoh of Egypt. Hatshepsut had died. Thutmose III then went on a great purge to try and wipe her memory from Egypt. She had reigned for a long time. Like I said, her monuments were everywhere. And so he went about trying to deface or destroy the monuments that she had put up to herself. And if he had lived long enough, he probably would have succeeded, but he didn't live long enough, and so he didn't get rid of all the monuments. So that's why the historians can go back and still find a lot of monuments to Hatshepsut, because he just wasn't able to get them all. Interestingly enough, Thutmose III, by historical accounts, now this is where it's going to get interesting, dies around the year 1450, which was the year that Moses turned 80, and is the estimated time of the Exodus according to the Bible. And it falls right at 480 years before Solomon dedicated the temple. This time of year is important in that he dies in the spring of that year, 1450. The year that Moses was 80, the year that Moses went back to Egypt and delivered the children of Israel out of bondage, was the exact year and the exact time of year, the spring, which would have been the time that they walked out of Egypt, that Thutmose III died. This means that Thutmose III was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, not Ramses II. Not only did he die in the right year, according to chronologies, he died in the spring in the right month to fit Passover. But there is a glitch, and this is where the historians have scratched their heads because of this glitch. Thutmose III did not have a firstborn son die that year. His firstborn son died years earlier. Amenhotep II, his successor, was the second son. Excuse me, his firstborn son died years later. Amenhotep II, his successor, was the second son. Since the Bible indicates that there was not a household in Egypt that did not lose a firstborn child, Exodus 12:29, including Pharaoh's household, how can this fit the Bible? Here's how. Only 2 years before Thutmose III died, he made his 18-year-old son, Amenhotep II, co-regent or co-pharaoh of Egypt. In other words, at the time of the Exodus, there were actually 2 pharaohs on the throne that were co-equal in power. Thutmose III, who was in Egypt and was the pharaoh of the Bible story of the Exodus, and then his son, Amenhotep II, who was in Syria at the time on a campaign. He was not in Egypt. All of the firstborn, of course, that died were all in Egypt, and God made that clear, that the firstborn in Egypt would die. Amenhotep was not in Egypt. He was in Syria on a military campaign. When his first unnamed firstborn son died as the death angel passed over Egypt. So when the death angel passed over Egypt, it was the grandson of Thutmose III, the son of Amenhotep II, who was in Egypt, who was a baby. We don't know his name, but he was the baby that died in Pharaoh's household when the death angel passed through Egypt. History shows that Amenhotep II had only been co-pharaoh for a couple of years when his firstborn infant son died. 2 pharaohs, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, simultaneously pharaohs of the Exodus. The answer is that Thutmose III died in the Red Sea. Remember Psalm 136 verse 15 says that Pharaoh and his army perished in the sea. So Thutmose III would have been that Pharaoh and would have died in the sea, according to the Word of God, and that also matches history that says he died in the spring of that year at the time of Passover. So history and the Bible are meshing here. This does not contradict the Bible at all. It explains something that historians have been looking for but couldn't find. There were 2 pharaohs of the Exodus. So once again, folks, the Bible is vindicated by history. Now, the point. Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to suffer friction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Why? Because of the teaching and the influence of his godly mother. I want to give you 7 points again about Jochebed. Number 1, Jochebed had the courage to resist evil authority. But notice she submitted to Egyptian authority while raising Moses. We have to be very wise in our application of Bible principle. We don't have a right to disobey authority just because we don't like them. There are some men who equate being a hothead rebel with being a principled patriot. And I want you to understand that there are no similarities between a hot-headed rebel and a principled patriot. There are a lot of people that just don't like to be told what to do. There are a lot of people that just don't like authority. Period. They don't want to submit to anybody over anything for any reason. I got to tell you, buddy, you can't justify that in the Bible. You cannot justify that spirit of rebellion in the Bible. Don't blame God for your stubbornness. God has established law and order. God has established human government. God has established the principles of leadership and the principles of civil authority as well as other kinds of authority in His Word. A child, as long as his parents are not abusing his authority, are not mistreating, and are not taking advantage of the authority and power that they have in the home, the child is responsible to God to honor and obey his or her parents. You kids cannot look at your dad when he asks you to make up your bed and clean up the clothes in your bedroom and say, "You're a tyrant. Pastor Baldwin said I don't have to obey you." Not. You have a responsibility before God to submit to your mom and to your dad. Unless they are asking you to do things that are directly against God, or abusing you in a way that is against God, you are to be respectful and honoring and submissive of them. The same thing is true with us as adults. Your boss at work has a right to tell you what to do on the job. Your teacher has a right to tell you how to behave in the classroom. The law enforcement officer has a right to enforce the laws of our community. We have an obligation to submit to those laws that are not contrary to the principles and the laws of God. Christians historically have been noted for being, for the most part, law-abiding people, and so we should be. Just because somebody tells us to do something that we don't like, or just because we don't agree with whatever the authority tells us to do, gives us no right to just rebel like a stubborn madman. I don't want to do it. Like a little child, pitch a fit because we don't want to be told what to do. That is not principled patriotism. Don't confuse the two. Jochebed submitted to the laws of Egypt as she raised her son in Pharaoh's household. She disobeyed that law that would have resulted in the death of her baby, and she had every right to do so. And you and I have every right to disobey any law that contradicts the plain fundamental teachings of God's principles and God's laws, especially those laws which deal with the preservation of life. That's why the Second Amendment issue is so important. It's because it deals with the protection and preservation of life. It's more than just owning a gun for the purpose of target shooting or hunting or recreational shooting. It's about the protection and preservation of life. To remove from citizens the right to protect themselves is to ask them to forfeit their lives, not only to the elements of criminal activity in and amongst us, but also to the potential of tyranny above us. She disobeyed when it was time to disobey. but she submitted when she should have. Our founding fathers, folks, did not rashly fire those shots on April 19, 1775. It was not a rash, hot-headed decision. They had been petitioning the crown for decades. The debating, the petitioning, the remonstrating, the redress had been going on for decades and decades and decades. They appealed, they reasoned, they went into court, and lawyers adjudicated the laws of the crown. They had some victories, they had more losses. Things kept escalating, getting worse. Until finally, when the government deliberately, volitionally decided that they would by force disarm the citizens in and around Boston, it was only then that those patriot fathers stood on Lexington Green and fought and fired the shot heard around the world, and our war for independence began. So we must understand clearly the principles of God, the principles upon which we must fight and must never compromise, and the issues in which we can submit, even though we may not agree. In Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson said that. Read it again. He said that. We suffer while these abridgments are sufferable. We will take abuse as long as we can. We will take mistreatment as long as we can. The desire on the part of the founders was to live in peace. For a Christian, our goal is to live in peace with our fellow man. That is our scriptural injunction. That is our goal. We are to live in peace with all men. Why are we supposed to pray for kings and for those that are in authority? That we may live a quiet and peaceable life with all godliness and honesty. That is the desire. So don't get caught up with some of these people that are out there promoting unwarranted violence. Be careful. The last thing we want to do is be standing on the wrong side of truth when the shooting starts. There's a great line in the movie Conager. Sam Elliott. There's a war coming. The bad guys are not giving up. It's getting worse. Everybody can see it coming. They're talking to another cowboy around the campfire. The cowboy's not sure what side to be on, not sure what to do. And Conager, Sam Elliott, looks at him and says, "Son, just be sure when the shooting starts, you're standing on the right side." Our founding fathers were standing on the right side of history, and they were standing on the right side of truth. They were standing on the right side of God's law when they fired those shots on April 19, 1775. But if they had fired those shots 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, it would not have been on the right side of history. She had the courage to resist evil authority when it was necessary, but she submitted to the Egyptian authority in raising Moses as necessary. Secondly, Jochebed had the faith to believe and trust God. This took a giant step of faith. for her to do what she was about to do with that little baby. Again, it was planned, premeditated. She wanted to find her. She wanted that queen to be there at that time, to see that baby, to hear that baby, to take that baby to herself. Tremendous faith and belief that God would protect that little baby Moses, and that he would use that Egyptian princess to do it. Her faith prompted bold and decisive action. It's one thing to say you believe God. It's one thing to say you trust God. It's another thing to act upon the faith and the belief that you say you have. Talk is cheap. Faith without works is what? Dead. She had the faith and the trust to act on her faith, and with bold, decisive action. Wow! What a step of faith she took. Number 4, her faith was rewarded, but her job was not finished. A lot of Christians make the mistake of thinking that whenever their faith is honored, that their job is finished. Listen, she had to give Moses the instruction he needed to make the right choice he made when he became a 40-year-old man. To do that, she had to instruct and teach. So even though baby Moses had been saved, was now safe, free from the death sentence of Pharaoh, actually living in the most unbelievable circumstance possible at the time, in the very home of Pharaoh himself, yet her job was not finished. Child of God, just because you have some answers to prayer, just because you have some blessings, just because you have some provisions, just because you have some needs met, does not mean your job is finished. Your job is not finished when you're comfortable. Okay, wow, I don't have to struggle anymore, and wow, the bills are paid, and wow, things are good now. I guess I can just go to the Bahamas, relax, and take it easy. And that's what a lot of Christians do. They get comfortable financially, and what do? They spend the rest of their life playing games. They spend the rest of their life on vacation. They spend the rest of their life just entertaining themselves. Can I say something? Thank you. The World War II generation, as great as it was, failed to pass on to their posterity the principles by which they lived by and by which they became the great champions of history that they became. The attitude coming out of World War II, going into the 50s and 60s, was, I don't want my children to know the hardship that I went through. I don't want them to know the adversity and the affliction and the trial that I endured. I want my kids to have the good life. Leave the farm, son, and go strike it rich in the city. Leave Montana and go to Los Angeles. Go where the jobs are. Go where the money is, boy. Get out there and make all you can. Enjoy the good life. That was the philosophy that my generation grew up with. And so that's what we did. We went to the cities, and we went to the corporations, and we went where the money was, and we went where the prosperity was, and we got our big jobs, and we got our nice cars, and we built our big homes, and we took our fancy vacations 3 or 4 times a year, and we put aside our nest eggs, and we reveled in the good life and the prosperous times post-World War II. And we forgot about the things that made us great. Greatness is not made by playing games. Greatness is not made by taking fancy vacations. Greatness is not made by making money and having all this extra free time on your hand to do whatever it is you want to do with your life. Greatness is made from hard work. Greatness is made from faithfulness and fidelity and the inner character traits that make a nation great. Greatness comes from working hard and sacrificing and going through trials and going through it with the right spirit and going to it with the right attitude and not giving up when times get tough. We have just gone through, over the last few years, a small taste of what our grandparents went through in the Great Depression. Small taste. My father and grandfather lived through the Great Depression, especially my grandfather. My dad was also. I've heard them talk so much about those days. I'm not trying to be an alarmist. I believe with all of my heart, if America doesn't have a change of course, and there's really nothing on the horizon to suggest that we are going to change course, but unless we have a change of course, America is sooner or later going to go through a time of affliction and trial that will either be similar to or greater to the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s. And if and when that happens, what will happen to society? What will happen to people when the government checks aren't delivered? What will happen to people when the stores have no food on the shelves? What will happen to people after weeks of no electricity? Our grandparents went through all of that, and they did so for the most part. Not all of them, of course. Not all of them, of course. But for the most part, our grandparents went through that period of trial and affliction with dignity, with character, with honor, with honesty. And they came through it with honor and character and decency and honesty. And that was the greatness of that generation. It's not the money, it's not the prosperity, it's not the vacations, it's not the retirements, it's not the houses and cars and clothes. It's the character in your heart to do right when it's tough. She used her knowledge to influence the one that God had given her to influence. And every one of us have people that we can influence. A child, a kinfolk, a friend, a neighbor, a classmate. Every one of us have someone or a group of someones that we can influence, that we can teach, instruct, encourage, help, instill. God has not put us on an island by ourselves. He's called us together to help and encourage and teach and instruct and uplift one another. And when we get the attitude that we no longer need to do that, and it's just all about me and all about what I want to do, and it doesn't matter about anybody else, and us four and no more, and God bless them, I don't care about anybody. When we get to that attitude, we're sunk as a society and as a country and as a state. Even though the miracle happened, the baby was delivered, he's living in the house of Pharaoh. Wow! What more am I supposed to do now? You're supposed to teach that little boy about where you came from. You teach him about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And you teach him about Joseph. And you teach him about creation. And you teach him about his people. And you teach him about his heritage and his history. So that when he's 40 years old and he's walking through the land as the prince of Egypt, potentially the next Pharaoh of Egypt, and he sees the taskmaster beating to death a Hebrew slave, something stirred in his heart. And he said, now's the time. I'm not taking it anymore. Mom did that. Mom did that. And then lastly, number 7, she is praised in God's hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. As Hebrews 11 writes the history of the Old Testament and mentions the heroes of the faith as examples to us in the New Testament era, it refers to the parents of Moses, Jochebed, the story of a great mother. Let's stand for prayer.